Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Panem Reborn. I'd like to thank everyone who helped make this series possible before we get started. So thank you to Christian Blanco, whose series, Tales of the Hunger Games, this series is based off of, so you can check out the link to his channel in the description. I'd also like to thank Andrew McLean for allowing me to use some of his art. He's awesome, and his blog is linked below in the description as well. I'd also like to thank my editors, Octavian Sthesia and Raby, for assisting with some of the episodes of this series, so thank you very much. And I also want to let you guys know something that's a little different this week is that we are going to have a content warning. There's going to be a content warning at 21:44, so please skip to 22:48 if you wish to avoid this. I will also state ahead of time in the audio when this scene is about to happen. I also want to let you guys know that we are going to be doing a Q&A. Hopefully in the next video, and if not the next video, then the 108th games. So I will post a comment below and you guys can answer what you have any questions about. So without further ado, let's dive into Panem for today. As in most years, District 2 had more volunteers than it could count for the 106th Hunger Games. Therefore, as was customary in this situation, all male and female volunteers competed in non-lethal games within the district that were divided by gender to decide on the eventual tributes who would compete in the games. 18-year-old Cyprian Mella, a young man with curly dark hair and pale skin, quickly outlasted all of his opponents by hiding and waiting for others to start fighting, before sneaking up and detonating their bracelets while they were distracted. His final opponent, Lucius, attempted to attack him from behind, but he delivered a well-timed backward groin kick to Lucius before jerking around and smashing all of his bracelets, crowning Cyprian as the winner as he casually whistled and dusted off his hands for comedic effect. 16-year-old Mercury Valens, a short and muscular young woman with lobbed auburn hair and hazel eyes, spent most of the mock games laying on the ground and pretending she had been wounded in the initial skirmish at the center of the arena, but swiftly defended herself and detonated the bracelets of any other girl who attempted to attack her. As she twisted the arm of her final opponent, Stacia, to the ground and dashed her bracelet to the ground while crushing it under her toe, it was announced that she had won the competition, to which she grinned and blew a cheeky kiss at her fallen opponents. Thus, Cyprian Mella and Mercury Valens were declared the official tributes representing District 2 this year for the 106th Hunger Games. Rosalia admitted that this pair certainly seemed like a duo to watch out for, showing considerably more charm and charisma than the usual batch of tributes from this district and waving to their supporters in the crowd. Both tributes were then congratulated by their families at the Justice Building. Cyprian was embraced by his proud parents, who complimented his nicely placed kick from the preliminary games, while Mercury was visited by her parents, older brother, and older sister, her siblings expressing their wistfulness about having never been reaped, but wishing her luck in the arena and reminding her to avoid golf carts if possible. The tributes said their goodbyes and were soon whisked away by two peacekeepers to get on the train to the capital. The pair were greeted at the door to the train by their mentor, Celia Barrett, victor of the 101st Hunger Games. She had recently dyed the tips of her dreadlocks an icy blue and was regarding them with a curious and analytical gaze as they entered. Cyprian respectfully shook her hand, while Mercury nodded to her as they sat down at the dining table. Celia called for an AVOX to fetch a late lunch for the group, politely inquiring about their days and encouraging them to tell her about their backgrounds and experience. She listened quietly and intently as they slowly opened up to her over their meals, nodding occasionally and paying diligent attention. The train was soon to arrive in the capital, but Celia advised them to trust their instincts in the arena, reminding them that even she had done this during her games and had killed her own district partner. Cyprian grinned and remarked that she had only killed him because he called her soft, though he failed to notice his mentor glaring at him for this remark and her hand twitching, poised over the table. As an astonished Mercury watched from her seat, her fork half speared through a green bean, Celia's fingers closed around a steak knife and she cocked her head before hurling it at Cyprian. The knife whistled past his ear and embedded itself in the wall behind him, startling a nearby AVOX and causing him to almost drop a tureen of soup on the floor. Cyprian gulped as his mentor tucked one of her locks behind her ear and reminded him in a measured tone to not call her soft or mention Gaius again. While the pair from 2 were considerably quieter from this point on, Celia seemed to calm down and assure them that regardless of the incident, she would do anything she could for District 2 to see another victory. Cyprian and Mercury listened intently as she explained that she had already tried to encourage her tributes in past years to use multiple different strategies, including betraying the ones and sticking together with the career pack until the end, but so far, none of these had worked, and they had all paid the price. She appeared especially annoyed as she said this last part, to the point that Rosalia speculated that she was still not over the humiliating deaths of the careers in the 105th Games. Therefore, Celia continued, she was going to try a new strategy and encourage Cyprian and Mercury to find their own strategies in the arena and what felt most natural to them, rather than blindly following her advice, as long as they did not get too cocky. Mercury nodded and held out a hand to Cyprian to shake, the pair agreeing in front of their mentor that they would work together in the arena to come up with plans that worked best for them, which earned Celia's approval as she stated that they certainly seemed brighter than the last bunch, perhaps referring to Rufus and Adora from the previous year's games. As the train pulled into Mace Station, she reminded them to keep their chins up and look fearsome, going around to each of them in turn and adjusting their hair and clothing until not a single hair or clothing fiber was out of place. Nodding approvingly, she helped them out of the train and onto the platform. The pair from 2 were immediately swarmed by eager citizens, delighted to see the annual favorites and begin scoping out if it was worthy to bet on them. Celia followed her tributes out, receiving cheers and applause from the assembled Capitolites despite her clear irritation at the bright flashbulbs and screaming fans. The pair posed for pictures, greeted children, and Cyprian even patiently tolerated an elderly grandmother who wished to plant a kiss on his cheek. Mercury's laid-back attitude was a hit with the teenagers in the crowd, signing autographs and grinning as a boy fainted from excitement upon seeing her. The presence of Celia proved to almost be stealing the spotlight from her tributes, as citizens called out for her to take pictures with them and sign their foreheads, as they had every year for the past 4 years. Celia desperately tried to redirect the action to her tributes, stating that they had her personal endorsement as excellent winner picks for this year, although the endeavor did not completely work out in their favor, since it was impossible to hear her over all the commotion. Eventually, she gave up trying to convince the crowd to pay attention and escorted her tributes away to their accommodations. The group met with their stylists, Cymbeline McCannon, who had helped dress Celia and her district partner back during the 101st Games. He appeared delighted to see his first victor again, kissing the mentor on both cheeks and exclaiming over her newly dyed hair. She hastily diverted his attention to her tributes, asking if he had any ideas for their parade costumes. Cymbeline directed them to a flip book he had placed on a nearby table, where he had created a series of stone-inspired designs to reflect one of District 2's 2 industries, stone quarrying. For Cyprian, he had made a shimmering silver suit covered in sequins, while Mercury had been given a matching jumpsuit with a neck scarf. The tributes seemed to appreciate the uniqueness of the costumes, running their fingers over the intricate sequins, and were quickly fitted for them while having makeup and hair done. During this time, Celia flipped on the television, appearing uninterested in Rosalia Sanchez's Reapings replay segment, and instead walking over to put in a tape of her own games. As the tributes were poked and prodded with sewing needles and makeup brushes, Celia pointed out the events that had occurred during her games and reminded the tributes that there would be a new head game maker announced during the interviews, who would likely be eager to create more action than the previous head game maker had done in the past few games, for fear of being sent away on vacation to the Mexican lands. The pair exchanged nervous glances at this and squared their shoulders. At last, having exhausted all of her commentary on her own games, Celia reluctantly returned to the reruns of Rosalia's Reaping coverage, where the Reapings in District 6 were being broadcast. She called her tributes to attention and reminded them to listen carefully, stating that District 6 was a known wild card nowadays, and it would be beneficial to study them with a degree of caution. As the twos watched, Mayor Cartwright wrapped up his annual speech in District 6 and welcomed last year's victor out to the stage to perform the Reapings. Heifer Muller, victor of the 105th Hunger Games, arrived on stage in a neutral mood and a lime green cowboy outfit, beginning to grow bored as he had just completed Reapings in 6 other districts earlier in the morning, one of which was a continent away from the rest of Panem. Rosalia admitted in her commentary that at least he was not drunk like Alexander last year, chuckling slightly to herself. The tension this year in District 6 was tangible to the pair from 2, even from the other side of the television screen. After the public execution of Casper Myers, the male tribute from this district in the previous year's games, and his family, hardly anyone felt comfortable enough to raise their eyes from the ground throughout the entire reaping ceremony. As the names of the 2 reaped tributes were called, a visible wave of relief coursed through those who were not chosen. Everywhere in the square, haunted eyes peered up at the stage, and frail arms clutched onto friends and family members in the sea of black clothing. Heifer stepped over to the female reaping bowl and drew a name, dwarfing the podium with his massive frame and having to duck down so that he could reach the microphone. He called the name of 14-year-old Ankara Vreeland, a skinny and short girl with greasy black hair pulled into a bun. She appeared to have dark circles under her eyes and several pinpricks along the length of her left arm. Ankara stared around dully, apparently unaware or uncaring about what was happening, as the peacekeepers escorted her to the front of the square, and her peers sighed in relief while congratulating each other for not being reaped. Rosalia commented that it was likely that she was fresh out of a morphling den. However, Ankara seemed to liven up more as she was deposited on the stage, and in fact, she hummed a small tune under her breath while passing the other reaping pens that sounded remarkably like a funeral march, drawing mild giggles from the front of the otherwise somber crowd. Heifer attempted to offer her a handshake, but Ankara ambled past him and continued to hum, ignoring him completely and fidgeting with a loose thread on her black dress. Heifer then awkwardly withdrew his hand and headed over to the male reaping bowl, now looking annoyed that he had just been made to look foolish on national television, and clearly wishing to be done with the reapings. Rosalia commented that he appeared as if he had not signed up for this part of a victor's duty, and was sorely regretting resurfacing after having driven a golf cart into the lake. The next name he called out was that of 17-year-old Bernd Sorkin. A short young man with curly dark hair and ashy skin, who appeared to be much younger than his age because of his height and small build, was pushed forward by the crowd and seemed distressed by the peacekeepers who arrived to steer him to the front. It was well known around the district that Byrne was one of the few clean youths who avoided the morphling dens entirely and worked as a baggage handler for capital officials who frequented the district for bureaucratic reasons. Rosalia read off an information sheet handed to her by an intern, stating that Byrne was the best friend of the deceased Caspar Myers, who had suffered greatly after his friend's highly publicized death and had never been quite the same, according to family and friends. He accepted Heifer's handshake and stood stiffly next to Ankara, though he continued to stare ahead with his brow furrowed as they were presented as this year's tributes from District 6. Byrne and Ankara were taken to visit their families before departing for the capital. Ankara had only a single sister, who limply hugged her and tried to make her look more presentable by combing her fingers through her hair and pulling her dress sleeves down to cover the needle marks, though Ankara twisted away from her and insisted she preferred the dress to be more comfortable rather than presentable. Byrne was visited by his parents and younger brother, although his father was heavily supported by a crude walking cane, and Byrne quickly gave up his chair for him. While he seemed disoriented and apprehensive, his family expressed their fury at his reaping in hushed tones, insisting that it was no accident that the best friend of Caspar Myers had been reaped, though they did not dare to voice these complaints in a louder voice owing to the pair of peacekeepers outside the door. Byrne tentatively offered them all hugs, exhaling and running his fingers through his hair with a dazed expression as peacekeepers arrived to take the tributes away. The pair from 6 were taken to the train station and soon met their capital mentor, Minola Pinch, a stern woman with a severe appearance that was somewhat more restrained than most capitalites. She surveyed them skeptically and, without warning, suddenly reached over and pulled out Ankara's hair tie. This caused her hair to fall out of her bun, and with it, a circular container with several dozen white tablets inside. Ankara became enraged at once, clawing at Minola as she held the pills out of reach. She continued to glare and demand that her property be returned as Minola pushed past her and tossed the pills out the window of the moving train. Byrne watched this scene with obvious discomfort, scratching his head and appearing as if he would have liked to be anywhere but there. Ankara shouted that Minola had just destroyed her past month's savings, insisting that she be compensated for the value of the lost pills, while Byrne covered his ears and rocked back and forth on the ground during the chaos, muttering an incomprehensible phrase that our audio analyst determined to be "not the white room." When at last Minola managed to get Ankara to calm down by having her restrained by 2 peacekeepers and seated at the dining table, Byrne appeared to relax and hesitantly joined them at the dining table to eat a quiet lunch. During this time, Minola sternly reminded her tributes that she would not tolerate any foolish behavior, and from this moment on, they were to shut up and listen up. For the next few hours, as Ankara sat sullenly in her seat flanked by peacekeepers, and Byrne stared grimly into a bowl of clear soup, Minola lectured them on playing to their district's strengths like camouflage and machinery operation, though she wrinkled her nose as she mentioned how last year's tributes had failed to do this. She then reminded them that other tributes would be looking to them as easy kills, and that they needed to ensure that they would not get on the bad side of strong competitors who would have an incentive to target them early on in the games. As Minola lectured, Ankara made goofy faces behind her back to Byrne's great amusement, though when Minola turned to see what Byrne was smiling at, Ankara's face reverted to a scowl. The train pulled into Mace Station shortly after, and Minola reminded her tributes to not make fools of themselves on the train platform, throwing an irritated look over at Ankara. The tributes awkwardly followed her like a pair of lost ducklings out of the train and onto the platform, where they at once appeared startled by the sheer size of the assembled crowd. Ankara proved to be accidentally popular with the Capitolites, who asked her to perform the funeral march she had been singing at the reaping, which she did with great confusion amid their cheers and attempts to take pictures. Byrne stood in the shadows of the train, eyes cast downward and seemingly uncomfortable with being the center of attention, though he occasionally glanced around at the bright lights in the distance and the glowing signs on the train platform. He continued to mumble something incomprehensible that even our audio analysts could not reconstruct. After a short period, once Minola sensed she was not going to get any more entertainment value out of her tributes, she steered them away to be taken to their apartment. As the group arrived at their apartment, they encountered their stylist, Ophelia Seaton, sprawled across a couch in the living room area and flipping through some designs. Ophelia thrust her arms out in excitement and embraced all three of them in a squashing hug, eagerly displaying her costume ideas. Surprisingly, in a much more pleasant twist than with last year's costumes, these were smartly designed and worked well with the district's industry. Byrne and Ankara were fitted for an old-fashioned suit and dress, respectively, that were accented with tiny functioning gears on the lapel of the suit and across the front of the dress. These spun and whirred softly throughout their fittings, giving them the appearance of stylized machines. Minola warned her tributes that she would be watching them, her eyes boring into Ankara's head, and watched them like a hawk until their costuming and makeup was complete, and they were permitted to go down to the parade preparation area. For the first time, as she saw their polished final looks, she appeared pleased. Many tributes had gathered in the parade area as the pair from 6 took the elevator down to join. Byrne and Ankara were shown to their chariot and horse, and although Byrne hopped up in the chariot and offered a hand to Ankara, she refused to get in. When he asked why she did not want to board, she loudly complained that she did not feel well and wanted to skip the parade. This clearly annoyed Byrne, who replied that the parade was mandatory and she would need to suck it up because everyone had to take part. Fortunately for Byrne, Donegal from 8 was passing by at that moment and gave him a sympathetic look, offering to help hoist the stubborn Ankara into the chariot. Byrne thanked him for the assistance as they lifted Ankara up, and she reluctantly clung to the side of the chariot. Meanwhile, at the front end of the line, Cyprian and Mercury had been getting to know the pair from 1, Cinter and Neela. While Cinter seemed to get along well with the twos and their combined charisma was enough for Rosalia to remark that they could charm the socks off the president himself, Neela had a persistent and slightly obnoxious close-talking habit that seemed to make the pair from 2 quite uncomfortable. Despite their differences, the group certainly seemed more organized and team-oriented than the careers in recent years, causing Rosalia to add that it was quite unusual for careers to be this unified. However, one of our analysts' favorite moments to replay from these games are the expressions of disgust and physical pain on the two's faces when Neela accidentally spit on them while talking at the parade area. The parade took place amid the usual cheering crowd of Capitolites as the tributes' chariots glided smoothly down the runway. Cyprian and Mercury gracefully waved to the crowd, allowing the scenic lighting to illuminate the shimmering sequins and give a rippling effect to their costumes, while Byrne valiantly attempted to hold up a swaying Ankara, who appeared to be feeling quite motion-sick in the chariot. Despite Ankara's unsightly display, Rosalia had to admit that the real whirring gears on the Six's costumes stood out from the rest of the costumes, and swiftly awarded them Best Dressed for the creativity of incorporating moving machinery into the outfits. As President Mace gave his speech, a few sequins from Cyprian's costume fell off and landed on Mercury's back. He appeared to notice the disruption and reached over to brush the sequins off his district partner, though suddenly Mercury let out a yelp and clutched her bottom, as this was where Cyprian had unintentionally been touching while trying to remove the sequins. In a knee-jerk reaction, she growled and slapped him across the face, causing him to reel backward and cry out in pain. The interaction was noticed by several other tributes, who began to giggle and point at the entertaining scene, while both Cyprian and Mercury burned bright red with humiliation. Fortunately, after a few seconds, everyone became distracted by applauding for the president's speech, and the parade was concluded. Byrne and Ankara were congratulated on their best-dressed win by Minola, but she berated Ankara for her behavior during the parade and told her that she would not last long in the arena if she continued to show such a poor attitude. She grumpily sent them off to bed a few minutes later, not even wishing to hear a response from her tributes. Byrne put a comforting arm around Ankara, seemingly brushing aside their conflict over the parade earlier, and gently steered her to bed, remarking that it would be best for her to get some rest. Celia reminded Cyprian and Mercury that they needed to get a good night's rest in order to be ready for training the following day, fixing Cyprian with a sharp glance as it was apparent she had heard him talking to Mercury on their way into the apartment about sneaking out to get drunk with Cinter when Celia was asleep. All tributes were awoken the following morning for training and were greeted by an irritable Gloria Steele, who had recently suffered a fall down the stairs after tripping on her grandson's Heifer-Muller action figure. Gloria had broken her right arm and leg, meaning she could not threaten people with her stun gun or water cannon, her favorite hobby. This resulted in her being in a foul mood throughout the training period, including while explaining the rules and overseeing the stations. Cyprian and Mercury moved around between the weaponry and survival stations, following their instincts to try a variety of skills after recalling their mentor's advice to do what felt most natural for them. Byrne attempted to try his hand at the archery station, but quickly gave up after witnessing Cinter hitting 5 bullseyes in rapid succession at the station. Despite this, he soon found he had quite the talent for camouflage and concealment, startling even the camouflage station trainer by popping up at him from the floor, where he had painted himself into the surface. Over the course of the 3 training days, Byrne seemed to grow more confident in his skills and branched out to a few more stations, displaying a quality that few from District 6 had expressed at all since the events of last year's games: hope. Ankara spent her time at the edible plants and camouflage stations, although it was unclear if she was genuinely attempting to gain new knowledge from these stations or loitering to avoid being disciplined for not participating. She wandered over to the hand-to-hand combat station and agreed to spar with Rosalie from 15, although she was easily disarmed by Rosalie and demanded a rematch, which she lost once again. Byrne offered to teach her some of the skills he had picked up, but she scowled and insisted she did not need his help before proceeding to spend the rest of the day feigning injury and laying down in the medical corner. Mercury appeared annoyed with Cyprian for the first time after he nearly burnt her at the fire-making station by placing a piece of kindling near her hand, and she began to tell him in no uncertain terms what she would do to him if he made this mistake again. However, before this conflict could go anywhere, Sinter and Neela invited them to join them at the knot station, and it was quickly forgotten. At the end of the 3 days of training, the tributes were sent to demonstrate their learned skills for the game makers. Cyprian was the third tribute to go, putting on an impressive display of dual-wielding 2 large spears. He successfully fended off a series of holograms sent at him and easily speared all of them through various body parts before grinning and offering an exaggerated bow to the game makers. Mercury followed, showcasing her agility by gracefully dodging volleys of blunted arrows fired from different walls in the room. She smiled and offered a mock curtsy to the game makers before sauntering out of the room, flipping her hair. Later on in the lineup were Byrne and Ankara. Byrne demonstrated solid knowledge of edible insects and plants before carefully camouflaging himself to the floor, with the only indication of his presence in the dark room being the whites of his eyes. Ankara sat on the floor and recited lyrical poetry for several minutes before being sharply reminded to not waste the game maker's time. She eventually got up and attempted a few half-hearted maneuvers with an automated robotic training dummy, although when it went on the offensive and hit her with its arm, she fell backward and did not bother to get back up for the rest of the evaluation, choosing to take an ill-timed nap on the ground instead. Just letting you guys know there is a content warning ahead for suicide. You can skip to minute 22, 48 seconds to avoid this scene if needed. Again, there is a content warning ahead, so please skip to 22, 48 to avoid this scene if you need to do so. Thank you for understanding. Another incident occurred during the evaluations this year, one that would forever change security measures implemented during training. Myrtille from 11 was a quiet girl who had spent most of her time in some of the less crowded survival stations throughout training. When she walked in to perform her demonstration for the game makers, she selected a small knife from the weapons rack to show some of her limited skills. However, what the game makers and training staff had failed to realize was that unlike the other weapons in the training center and at the evaluations, this knife had not been blunted by mistake. The game maker's boredom quickly turned to surprise and horror as Myrtille smiled and ran her finger along the tip before raising it to her throat and slashing it across with a dark smile. As she collapsed to the floor in a growing pool of blood, the game makers leaped to their feet in shock and immediately rang for a team of AVOXs to clean up, surveying the situation with great anger and embarrassment at this oversight. Myrtille was hastily carted out in a side exit from the room, and most of the game makers left the observation deck in a hurry to hold an emergency meeting. The most junior of the game makers were told to stay behind and perform the evaluations of the pair from District 15. An emergency meeting was conducted by the game makers, followed by an impromptu press conference in which they confirmed to all of Panem that a tribute had died to an unforeseen training equipment malfunction. There would be no replacement for Myrtille, as it was too late in the pre-games process to re-reap a female tribute from District 11, but the games would continue on with 23 tributes. A representative from the game makers announced that in the future, all weapons would be triple inspected ahead of time during training and evaluated to ensure that all were blunted correctly. Cyprian and Mercury high-fived upon hearing this news, relieved that there was one less tribute to have to kill in the games, while Byrne and Ankara privately admired Myrtille's unwillingness to play by the game makers' rules. The scores for all the remaining tributes were released after the incident. Sinter from 1, Cyprian from 2, and Mercury from 2 rested at the top with a score of 10. Closely following them were Tessa from 4 and Scamp from 11, with 8s each. Byrne scored in the middle of the pack with a 6, while Ankara was near the bottom with a 2. Celia congratulated her tributes, although she reminded them that their training score did not determine their luck in the arena. Manola had given up on her tributes at this point and simply offered Byrne grudging congratulations, while ignoring Ankara as usual. Despite the day's chaotic events, the tributes were apprehensive but intrigued to meet the new head game maker the following evening during the interviews. This year's interviews were highly anticipated due to the introduction of head game maker Marin's replacement after President Mace had sent them abroad for mental health recuperation. However, before this interview could take place, the tributes still needed to be interviewed so Panem could be officially introduced to its competitors for the 106 games. Being from District 2, Mercury was early on in the lineup, emerging from backstage in a sleek dress made to look like a glittering peacekeeper uniform. Rosalia Sanchez had arrived for the evening in a bright dress that appeared to be doodled on in a comic book style, sparking discussion in the audience and around the Capitol as to how this related to this year's arena. Mercury greeted Rosalia as she mounted the stage, and they exchanged a warm hug before Mercury was seated to begin the interview. They discussed the Capitol food as well as Mercury's weapons of choice, which she explained to be knives due to their versatility, stating that people could hide knives in everything from high heels to pens. Over the course of the interview, she carefully answered every question asked by Rosalia and admitted that she considered herself to have a short temper, but that she would try to tone down this aspect of her personality in the arena. Mercury was respectfully applauded at the conclusion of her interview for impressing the audience with her sharpness. Cyprian arrived on stage after this and was greeted by wild cheers from the Capitol, specifically the younger audience, who had seemed to become quite breathless at the sight of the attractive young career. Rosalia remarked that perhaps some of his appeal was in his somewhat vampiric look, with his dark hair and pale skin, though Cyprian appeared embarrassed and declared that he did not want to be known as a pretty boy, but rather for his skills and expertise with multiple types of weapons. Rosalia jokingly inquired if he sparkled in sunlight, to which he replied that he did not and refused to demonstrate this under the stage lights. Cyprian was clearly uncomfortable with the audience's suggestive behavior during the interview, although he put on a roguish smile for the audience and waved as he exited the stage. Ankara showed up on the stage in a dress studded with small gears, but quickly confronted Rosalia by leaning forward and trying to draw on her dress with her finger at various times throughout the interview, eyes slightly unfocused and occasionally muttering incomprehensible phrases under her breath. Rosalia attempted to make light of this strange situation and joked that she wondered if Ankara was trying to put a curse on her, but the girl suddenly grinned and commented that the interview looked like a coloring book, howling with laughter that echoed the small giggles spreading throughout the Capitol crowd during this spectacle. Rosalia scowled and snapped that her dress had been custom made by a top Capitol designer for the occasion, for once appearing to lose her cool during the interview. Rosalia continued to glare as Ankara mimed firing paintballs at her dress, practically shooing the girl off the stage in a fit of rage and bringing out Burn next. He seemed to freeze up slightly on stage at the beginning, shrinking in his gear-studded suit, but over several minutes grew gradually more comfortable as Rosalia asked about his life, and he opened up about his difficulties at home supporting his parents and brother. However, he was greeted with a chilly reception from the audience, who had not forgotten the game's cheating scandal in the previous year and had tuned into Rosalia's commentary when she explained that Byrne was friends with the cheater during the reapings. Despite Rosalia's efforts to politely question him and avoid discussing the 105th games, even she could not ease the level of tension between the stage and audience at this time. At last, the long-awaited reveal and interview of the new head game maker were slated to occur. The screen behind Rosalia turned white, reflecting a human silhouette behind it, as she withdrew from the folds of her dress and began to read off a script. Rosalia explained that after the retirement of head game maker Marin, President Mace had looked far and wide to find a suitable replacement from among the Capitol's top military officers and those who had bravely served during the annexing. She stepped aside and slowly spread her arm out to indicate the silhouette, and to the great surprise of the audience, it split into two. Two figures stepped out from behind the screen, sporting identical shaved heads, crisp pantsuits, and heeled white boots that clicked softly against the gleaming stage floor. Rosalia introduced to an amazed Capitol crowd their new head game makers, twin brother and sister Virgil and Vivian Locke. Young and talented military officers who had risen in the ranks during the annexing, the Locks were well known in many Capitol circles. The incident with Myrtille had been overlooked this year due to them being new game makers and the incident being blamed on their more experienced colleagues, so they appeared relaxed and ready to be interviewed by a thrilled Rosalia. She invited them to share the large chair across from her, shaking their hands vigorously in turn. The new head game makers sat down and surveyed the crowd, smiling politely and acknowledging the cheers with slight waves of their gloved hands. Rosalia first inquired about the head game makers themselves, inviting them to share more information about their backgrounds growing up during the Great War and enlisting in the Capitol's military technology forces. Virgil and Vivian promised that their wartime backgrounds had given them a good grasp of different terrains and places, but that the arena for this year would be a callback to the time before, or the era before Panem became Panem, while still retaining some special features related to Panem itself. Rosalia pressed the pair for more information on the crowd's behalf, but they simply replied that this was sure to be an action-packed games. Virgil wiggled his eyebrows as he said this, leading to much discussion and debate over late-night programming about if this clue was deliberately given or happened to be emphasized accidentally. They also addressed an issue that had come up in the course of planning this year's games, explaining that the Capitol was still experiencing some difficulties with breeding mutts and training new personnel to work on mutt design and creation after some had been fired due to the squirrel incident the previous year relating to Casper Myers. Thus, they admitted that this year would not have any mutts in the arena while these difficulties were being handled, and anticipated working on the issue throughout the 106th and 107th games. They advised patience to the Capitol viewers, who cheered the pond, hearing that live mutts would likely return at full capacity for the 108th games. The new head game makers were given a warm send-off for the night by the Capitol audience, who appeared excited to see what they had in store for the 106th games. Rosalia reminded viewers to tune in over the coming days to watch the games and live coverage after dismissing the locks, before closing for the night with her new signature sign-off, "Good night, Panem." Most of the tributes had spent a sleepless night wondering what new horrors the two head game makers had in store for them this year. With not just one, but two figures in charge, there were bound to be new twists that had never been attempted by head game maker Marin in the past. In the morning, Celia awoke her tributes and drilled them on their bloodbath strategies as they dressed in the tribute outfits for this year, which were revealed to be skin-tight, district color-coded spandex outfits with a sash and belt across the front and two pants pockets. Celia furrowed her brow at the costumes and seemed to be trying to decipher their relevance to a potential arena, but Cyprian and Mercury suggested that the costumes might be related to the theme of the games rather than the arena itself, causing Celia to slowly nod in agreement. While Celia was sending her tributes down to the launch tubes and seeing them each off privately, the pair from 6 shared a small hug for support. Once they were separated to be taken to their tubes, Minola ignored Ankara as usual and instead set her sights on Byrne. She wished him well as he stepped into his tube and adjusted his belt, the two exchanging a brief but tense nod as the tube began to rise and the countdown commenced. The tributes all seemed wary of what could be happening as the tubes arose, clearly curious about the arena and how they might adapt themselves to it. Slowly but surely, the tubes rose through carpeted flooring into the central lobby of a spacious, modern convention center. The entire center was decked out as if hosting a Hunger Games convention, with all of the doors to individual meeting rooms open and showcasing a variety of costume displays, merchandise stands, and even cardboard standees of the past Hunger Games victors of all incarnations. The tributes stared around in complete shock at their surroundings, clearly having expected anything but one great reference to past games, and slightly confused as they did not recognize many of the past victors by their apparent alone, but rather from their history books at school. The cornucopia, located at the center of the lobby near a large staircase, contained tomahawks, knives, torches, swords, and most notably, several sharpened golf clubs. Rosalia questioned why the game makers would include the treasonous victors that had protested against the Capitol at the conclusion of the second incarnation, though other commentators pointed out that regardless of if the victors were on the right side or not of history, they were still a part of history. Their likenesses populated every nook and cranny of the arena, making it so that one could hardly turn a corner without running into some kind of victor memorabilia. Cyprian and Mercury nodded to Cinter and Neela, indicating for the group to run in for some of the weapons. Ankara eagerly stared down an Estelle Van Roosh costume display from her location, and twirled around on her podium as if imagining herself in the same arena outfit worn by the past victor, although Byrne tried to snap his fingers at her to get her to pay attention and work with him. Scattered around the outside of the cornucopia were smaller bags of typical snack stand food, such as soft pretzels, bottled drinks, and popcorn. As the gong sounded in the distance, Byrne leaped off his podium and snapped up 2 of these bags and a water bottle, tucking them under his arm as he sprinted away with blazing eyes. He once again attempted to drag Ankara with him, but she stood rooted to her podium and continued to seem distracted. Byrne gave up and fled as other tributes neared their location, charging into an empty elevator and heading up to the second floor. Most fleeing tributes had run for the escalators, which were a guaranteed way to leave safely, but which also caused a large traffic jam. This resulted in Noel from 15 being angrily shoved down the escalator by Tara from 5, immediately hitting his head hard on every step along the way, and causing his death soon after. The girl from 8 also fell victim to the traffic jam when she tripped up the escalator and fell backward, tumbling down to her death. Back at the cornucopia, the careers had stuck with their usual strategy of laying siege to the area and attacking any in their path. Mercury was assailed by the pair of 10 before she could even reach a weapon, but landed a sickeningly crunching punch to the girl's face and smashed her head into the boy's head. Just as Mercury was killing this pair, Cyprian had managed to seize a tomahawk and was jamming it into the face of the girl from 7, with whom he had fought over a backpack full of food. Cinter and Neela were fighting back to back, dispatching Ivan from 3 and the boy from 4 with swords from the cornucopia. Neela had debated grabbing a torch, but Cinter had reminded her that the torches could probably burn down the indoor arena if mishandled, resulting in very bad consequences for them, and she hastily relented. Behind them, Cyprian and Mercury fought back to back, mowing down Eve from 3 and the boy from 5 in rapid succession. Mercury grinned and remarked that they made a good pair, to which Cyprian smirked and dryly responded that he was already in a relationship, though when Mercury quirked an eyebrow and asked who he was dating, he laughed and replied, "Food." Cinter quickly told Neela to duck, and as she obliged, he hurled a tomahawk past her into the neck of Spruce from 7. Ankara stood rooted to her podium with her eyes glazed over, even after most of the bloodbath had cleared out, to the point where the careers noticed her strange behavior and walked up to her, attempting to determine if she was a tribute or a strategically placed statue. When they observed her blinking, Neela loudly and gleefully declared that this must be a tribute with almost inappropriate relish, causing Cyprian and Mercury to look at her oddly. Cinter cocked his head to the side, staring at Ankara, but suddenly she grinned in a dreamy way and spat at him. He shouted in alarm and disgust, staggering backward as Cyprian rolled his eyes, grumbled at Cinter to stop making a scene, and plunged his sword into Ankara's heart. She crumpled back onto the podium like a rag doll, just as the 11 bloodbath cannons were sounded out. On the second floor, the mezzanine level that overlooked the first floor, Burns sprinted down the corridor amid the thundering footsteps and mechanical grinding of elevators and escalators as tributes scrambled to find hiding places and disperse. Eventually, he located an unoccupied room at the end of the hallway, which he identified as Room 19. Glancing around to ensure there were no tributes in the hallway that could see him, he crept inside and peered around. It was one of the smaller meeting rooms in the convention center, but appeared to be a storage space, containing several large boxes of graphic tees with slogans and images from the various past games. The room also contained tall stacks of teetering boxes, filled to the brim with novelties like printed socks, buttons, and stickers, all themed to previous games as well. Burns settled down for the rest of the day and made himself a blanket out of 2 The Torturer shirts, listening to the faint sounds of running and whispering coming from tributes moving around the halls. At one point, a set of pounding footsteps stopped right outside the door, spooking Burn and causing him to tuck himself into a cardboard box with only his eyes peeking out until the footsteps moved away. Occasionally, screams and shouts echoed throughout the convention center, though no more cannons sounded all night. Burn seemed unnerved by the uncomfortable noises, popping open a soda bottle and raising it with shaking hands to his lips. His face, obscured by shadows in the room, was hardly visible, but the most eagle-eyed viewers and commentators could see how gaunt and hollow his cheeks appeared in the faint light from the windows. Meanwhile, the careers had finally gotten themselves together after recovering from the bloodbath and were searching for a room that was both free of other tributes and secure enough to store their belongings. They finally settled on Exhibit Hall C on the first floor, which was centrally located and offered a restroom inside as well as plenty of space. Exhibit Hall C contained rows of large and extremely realistic statues of all past victors, each with their own dedicated merchandise stand and life-size fact sheets. The careers poked and prodded around the exhibit hall, though Mercury and Cinter mocked Cyprian for being spooked by the lifelike victor statues and commenting that he thought the eyes on the Limerick Manx statue were following him around the room. As the sun set over the great glass overhang in the lobby, the portraits of both tributes from 3, Cricker from 4, the boy from 5, Ankara from 6, both tributes from 7, the girl from 8, both tributes from 10, and Noelle from 15, were projected indoors in each room. Overnight, there were no deaths or skirmishes, though many alliances slept in shifts and always kept at least one member guarding their camps for the sake of caution and to watch out for potential ambushes. The next morning dawned with a commotion at the career camp. Mercury had discovered that Neela had rolled over in her sleep and had been spooning her all night, resulting in her screeching and shoving the other girl off her. Neela hastily apologized but was clearly amused by Mercury's discomfort, though she soon irritated all of the other careers as they realized she had also rolled on top of their bags and squashed some of the food while sleeping. The group decided to explore the area to try and find other tributes during the day, in spite of everyone's annoyance with Neela's behavior. The Alliance roamed around the convention center's lower floor first, sticking their heads in various exhibit halls and closets along the way and working as a well-oiled machine to inspect the first floor. However, the group decided to split up after an hour to cover more ground, as they realized the truly large size and scale of the arena. Cyprian and Cinter agreed to search the remainder of the bottom floor, while Mercury was grudgingly assigned to cover the mezzanine and upper floor with Neela. The boys took a sword and 2 knives with them on their journey, scouring the bottom floor for tributes. They worked efficiently as a team, combing every exhibit hall and food stand, as well as the mailroom, for signs of others in the area. However, because the boys were so calm and methodical, the cameras decided to focus on Neela and Mercury instead, who were anything but calm and methodical while searching, unceremoniously casting valuable victor memorabilia items aside and often causing them to crash into walls or smash into pieces. Making matters worse, Mercury was still irritated with Neela after her behavior the previous night and even snickered when she boarded the elevator and the doors almost closed on Neela's face behind her. Once she was safely inside the elevator and the girls were being transported to the second floor, armed with 2 tomahawks and a knife, Neela demanded to know what Mercury had against her and why she had been so hostile about the previous evening. Mercury irritably snapped back that she would not have anything against Neela if she did not talk an inch away from her face and spoon her in her sleep on national television, though she appeared to regret this outburst a moment later and tensed up. Neela scoffed in response, loudly asking Mercury if her rudeness was due to it being that time of the month, to which the girl from 2 instantly turned bright red and clenched her hands to avoid throttling her ally. After taking a deep breath and restraining herself, Mercury replied that it was in fact not that time of the month and seemed quite relieved when the elevator finally stopped. The girls stepped out and ceased talking as they looked around the mezzanine area for signs of life, but failed to see anyone in the immediate area. The girls headed into room 14 on the mezzanine, noting from a directory on the wall that the floor contained rooms 12 to 19. This was a large meeting room space converted to a storage room, although not nearly as large as the exhibit halls downstairs. Inside, while they scoured the room for any potentially hiding tributes, Mercury discovered a crate covered with a tarp and branded "Handle with Care, Flammable Contents." Curiously, she removed the tarp and peered inside. As all of Panem watched, Mercury hastily looked over her shoulder to see if Neela was paying attention before pulling out what appeared to be several small action figures and sticking them in her bag. Upon closer inspection, viewers could see that the figurines were also themed to past victors, with several of the ones Mercury collected being posed in some of their more standout moments from their games. Mercury continued to fill her bag with the figurines before quickly replacing the tarp on top of the box and turning to discuss with Neela where they would head next. Downstairs, Cyprian had become particularly intrigued by a food stand in the corner with a large green sign of President Mace with long hair and stars gathered around him, as well as a sign reading Mace Bucks. He called Cinter over to help him figure out if there were any tributes hiding in Mace Bucks, but appeared intrigued by the contents of a refrigerator inside the stand, curiously pulling out a few bottles labeled Caramel Macchiato. He appeared confused by the mysterious drink, but nonetheless opened one of the bottles and daintily sniffed the contents. Cinter, peering over, suddenly smacked the bottle out of his hand and reminded him to not drink anything suspicious he found in the arena. Reluctantly, Cyprian returned the bottle to the refrigerator, and the boys wandered over to wait near the elevator for the girls to return. Upstairs, the girls continued to look around the remaining floors, although they found no tributes and presumed that they had all fled or hid when they heard the girls in the elevator. After taking a cursory but lazy glance around the spacious meeting rooms on the 3rd floor, the girls crossed back to the elevator bank near Ballroom 5 and pressed the down button, waiting for the elevator to rise to their level. Neela began to excitedly discuss her life back home and her jewelry collection in order to ease the tension, bragging to Mercury that it was one of the best in District 1. She briefly turned away for a moment to continue her one-sided conversation, and Mercury carefully glanced down at her bag. Growing tired of Neela's rambling, she scooped up a Chief Jaworski figurine from inside the bag, taking several hurried steps backward and hurling it at Neela's exposed back in an effort to distract her from her irritating talking. The figurine bounced off of the girl, confusing her and causing her to turn around before it exploded in her face. Neela's ensuing scream was lost in the resulting shattering of the figurine as blood and gore from her body splattered out in the hall. Mercury winced and staggered back in shock, raising an arm to avoid getting completely covered in Neela's remains and turning pale with surprise at the unexpectedly deadly nature of the figurine, muttering a sheepish statement that we later reconstructed. It said flammable, not explosive. However, she appeared delighted that it had still killed Neela, a dark and vicious grin crossing her face a few moments later as she seemed to realize the damage that the action figures could inflict. She hurriedly grabbed a bag and ran into the elevator while Neela's cannon sounded, shaking her head grimly at the body parts behind her being airlifted by a hovercraft out of the arena. As Cinter and Cyprian lingered near the elevator banks on the 1st floor, the doors opened and a blood-soaked Mercury stepped out from the elevators alone. The boys cried out in alarm, scurrying over to their ally, and demanded to know what had happened to Neela and why their other ally was covered in blood. Looking around furtively, Mercury replied that they had been ambushed by Donegal from 8, and he had thrown an exploding object at Neela right in front of her, although she had not been able to tell what it was. She clenched the bag tightly behind her as she said this, knuckles white with tension. The boys looked at each other and Mercury with worry, as Cinter seemed confused as to how a boy from 8 could have overpowered or attacked 2 careers, but agreed that they would need to keep a close watch out for Donegal in the coming hours and days. The group retired to their exhibit hall campsite to eat dinner and choose sleeping shifts, while Mercury tried to wash off her bloody jumpsuit in a bathroom sink. Byrne had spent the second day roaming the mezzanine and attempting to form a mental map of the arena, though even in the light of the glass-paneled hallway, his grim and tired expression was evident. He heard tributes walking past him on the mezzanine many times, notably Neela and Mercury's footsteps as they searched the area, but was able to scurry into room 19 and curl himself safely into a crate in the corner with his bag when they entered to inspect it. However, Byrne was delighted to discover that a passing tribute had dropped a knife on the ground near the entrance to the room, and he quickly pocketed it before returning to his campsite to strategize about his next actions. Once again, the rest of the day passed without further incident, and the tributes continued to remain far apart from each other in the large arena, as Rosalia wondered about the new head game maker's strategy, and hoped that there would be some real action soon on behalf of restless capital citizens. At the end of the second day, the portrait of Neela from 1 was projected in each room for all tributes to see. The night passed rather smoothly once more, with many tributes still recovering from the chaos of the first day, and most of the careers still reeling from losing one of their own on the second day. The third day began just as slowly, but Byrne was awakened from his sleep late in the morning by a commotion coming from outside below the mezzanine. As he stumbled out of his makeshift bed of shirts and poked his head out onto the mezzanine, he heard shouting and footsteps from downstairs and further along the mezzanine towards the elevators. Viewers could see that the 3 remaining members of the career pack had attempted to enter an elevator to explore more of the upper floors, only to be inadvertently blocked by Donegal from 8 and Tara from 5, who had been coming down in the elevator but panicked when hearing the careers outside and were trying to close the doors and send the elevator back upward again. Cyprian tried to shove his way through and into the elevator as Cinter and Mercury hit all the buttons on the outside of it in an attempt to bring it back down. Cyprian soon gave up and directed them to head to an unoccupied elevator and send it up so they could still try and catch Donegal and Tara. To the group's shock, as they ran from elevator to elevator, each alerted them that it would take 30 seconds to return to their floor. Finally, Cinter found an open elevator and led the charge into it for the group. The elevator landed on the 3rd floor, not the mezzanine as they had desired, but Cyprian dashed out of the elevator and pointed out that Grain and Sasia from 9 were down the hall trying to board another elevator to get away from them. At the same time as the careers began to exit the elevator, Tessa from 4 and Scamp from 11 emerged from other elevators and yelped at the sight of the charging careers. Everyone on the 3rd floor began to panic as they witnessed the chaos unfolding, unsure of what to do or if it was wise to board any elevators at all. With a great clattering, another elevator's doors rattled open nearby to reveal that Rosalie from 15 had come up from the mezzanine and was quickly trying to close the doors and return, due to the presence of so many other tributes staring at her. All in all, there appeared to be general chaos as tributes tried to escape each other using the elevators, but ended up encountering others on different floors instead. The careers turned to each other to figure out a new plan, as it was obvious that they could not attack anyone when the elevators kept opening and closing at random intervals. Cinter suggested that they only go after Donegal, as he was responsible for the death of his district partner. Any other tributes they found along the way would just be casualties. Cyprian eagerly agreed, while Mercury appeared to pause for a moment before recalling her lie and nodding a second later. After several minutes of clanging elevator doors and beeping buttons, they were able to secure an empty elevator down to the mezzanine, where Cyprian stepped out first and managed to see that a spooked Donegal had just stepped out of another elevator down the hall and was alarmed to notice him standing a few yards away. Cyprian yelled out in surprise, stabbing a figure in Donegal's direction, but by the time the other couriers emerged and looked around, the boy had disappeared into another elevator. The couriers charged into the elevator he had just been using, commanding it to return to the 3rd floor. Once again, they barely missed him as he dived into an elevator alongside Scamp and Tara. Mercury exclaimed in frustration that there seemed to be some sort of conspiracy against the careers, furiously jabbing at the buttons with increasing fervor and sending their elevator back down to the 1st floor. They finally managed to track down Donegal, who was with his 2 allies, waiting for Rosalie's elevator to reopen to admit them at the end of the main 1st floor lobby. However, the moment Scamp and Tara seemed to realize that the careers were only after Donegal, as Cinter shouted that he was going to pay for killing his district partner, they shoved him behind them and darted into the elevator, leaving Mercury to charge at him and bury her tomahawk in his head before he could reveal his confusion at this statement, as he had not actually killed Neela. The careers grinned in unison as his cannon sounded, Cinter and Cyprian with smugness and Mercury with relief, but they were clearly disoriented within a moment by the constant opening and closing of the elevators. Just as everyone was finally recovering from all of the running around and elevator hopping, head game makers Lock and Lock announced in unison that in 30 seconds, the entire arena would lose power and be plunged into a blackout. The power would only return after 12 hours or after 3 tributes died, whichever came first. The careers were almost immediately sponsored a pair of night vision goggles. After a brief argument among the careers over who deserved the night vision goggles the most, Mercury won out over the boys by wrenching them from Cinter's hands and securely fitted them to her head. The arena soon descended into an eerie darkness, with most tributes sheltering in place to attempt to wait out the 3 hours. Rosalie had been caught while inside an elevator and was trapped inside the elevator compartment for the entire time during the blackout, with no light and hardly any supplies. The careers sprinted up a frozen escalator on the first floor to get to the mezzanine floor, with Mercury leading the way and Cyprian and Cinter following closely behind. Cyprian held Mercury's hand with one hand and Cinter's with the other, as if the group were in a kindergarten line with her as the line leader. Mercury led them into the main area of the mezzanine and stopped to look around, though Cyprian almost bumped into her, resulting in a sharp reprimand as she searched around for tributes and tried to assess their situation. The boys tried to feel around with their arms and kept grabbing various body parts on each other by accident, with Mercury swiftly ending the confusion by slapping Cinter after he accidentally hit her breast. She dragged the 2 boys behind her and entered room 16, only a few hundred yards from Byrne's location. The group stumbled around inside for a minute as they heard shouting and screams coming from the floor above, followed by a cannon. This was the cannon of Tara from 5, who had accidentally run into the Nines and was killed in the ensuing scuffle in the darkness. The Nines believed they had caught a strong outlier, while Tara believed she was being ambushed by the careers, causing confusion and bewilderment on both sides. Byrne heard the commotion, having carefully concealed himself during the elevator chaos, and gathered his possessions before sprinting out of room 19 and whipping past the careers into the hall. Cyprian heard the gust of air go by as Byrne hurried past him, but his attempt to grab Cinter's arm and inform him of the presence of another tribute failed, as Mercury had finished peeking into room 16 and started walking the kindergarten line towards room 17, causing both boys to stumble along after her. Byrne took this opportunity to feel around for and run up the stationary escalator to the 3rd floor, exhaling sharply in relief at having avoided these tributes. He smacked directly into Tessa, who was about to head down the escalator, and whispered that the careers were down there and it would be inadvisable for her to go that way. She thanked Byrne for the tip, and they hurried across the hall to shelter together and attempt to wait out the blackout in ballroom 20. Below this, on the mezzanine, other tributes heard a loud bang and what sounded like something shattering coming from room 17. This was revealed by night vision cameras to be the careers encountering Scamp in room 17, who had been hiding under a table full of Victor-themed playing cards. Upon hearing Mercury kick in the door, Scamp had thrown the playing cards at her, unaware that the cards were designed to be razor sharp. One card nicked Mercury in the shoulder through her jumpsuit and made a thin but stinging cut, causing her to roar in pain and rage, pulling her allies into the room. A fight ensued moments later as Scamp frantically hurled the cards at the careers and they tried to dodge, tripping on boxes and each other in the small space. Soon, Mercury had enough of the confused fight and ripped a Hamish Abernathy figurine from her bag, throwing it at Scamp as he ran back to hide at the back of the room. The figurine pinwheeled into Scamp's chest and exploded in a spray of sparks, killing him instantly and eliciting cries of confusion from Cinter and Cyprian, who could not see what had just happened. Scamp's cannon sounded while the bumbling careers backed out of the room, although Mercury quickly snapped her drawstring bag together to avoid the action figures being touched by her allies. She directed the group to run upstairs to the 3rd floor and search the ballrooms for tributes trying to wait out the blackout. On the 3rd floor, Byrne and Tessa were about to exit ballroom 20 when they heard the blundering career alliance outside and shrunk back into the shadows. Mercury, Cinter, and Cyprian charged up the unmoving escalator stairs and headed in the opposite direction, towards ballroom 5. Byrne and Tessa hurried out of ballroom 20 as they realized this, hoping to cut around the front and escape via an elevator to a lower floor. Just as they did so, there was a great clattering sound from the escalator directly outside ballroom 20. The pair attempted to identify what was happening, but could not tell. Arena cameras showed that this came from the tributes from 9, who had dropped one of their bags accidentally and were struggling to pick it up in the dark before fleeing down the escalator. Rosalia Sanchez, who had little commentary on the games up to this point, declared that this arena event appeared to have created a strange occurrence of freeze tag, with tributes seeming to scatter from the careers and run away the moment they heard the thundering of their footsteps on nearby escalators or elevators. To Byrne's shock, a silver parachute drifted down for him and Tessa, which they eagerly opened to reveal a single flashlight. Looking at each other nervously, they turned on the flashlight and Tessa shined it at the tributes from 9, who immediately shielded their eyes with their hands and began to protest, scrabbling around for their weapons. Byrne looked for a long, hard moment at the discombobulated 9s before stepping forward and giving Grain a hard shove. Grain cried out in surprise and fright as he tumbled backward into Sassia, still clutching one of their bags in her hands. Unfortunately for the pair, it was at this time that they realized the only way to fall was down. The force of Byrne's push knocked them a step down the escalator, and they crashed down the rest of the escalator, hitting every single step with a painful bump along the way as Tessa shined the flashlight down at them. Grain's force crushed Saskia beneath him, sounding her cannon immediately. Byrne rushed down the stairs and snatched the bag from his trembling hands before ripping out a knife and slashing his throat. Grain choked for a moment, eyes rolling back into his head, but collapsed back onto his district partner as his cannon sounded. Byrne stared at his own bloodied hands, breathing heavily and dropping the knife. Surprisingly, he seemed almost confused, as if he had not consciously done these actions that killed the two tributes and was being controlled. The cameras only captured his sickened, fearful expression for a moment before Tessa called down to him that the careers were coming back and they needed to flee. She tossed the flashlight down to him and dashed down the escalator to join him, but everyone was startled suddenly by the power being restored and all lights flashing back to life. Head game makers Locke and Locke explained that because 3 tributes had died, the blackout event was over. A confused Mercury propped the night vision goggles up on her forehead and looked around. Cinter sighed in relief while Cyprian nursed several bruises he had sustained during their foray in the dark and scowled at his district partner for getting the boys beaten up during the event. The career group entered Ballroom 5 on the 3rd floor to take a breather and compose themselves as they assessed each other's injuries from the blackout. Cyprian remarked that he seemed to have a small burn on his arm and questioned what could have created this, though Cinter shrugged and Mercury dismissed it as an accident, placing a protective hand over the bag with the action figures. Down on the mezzanine level, Byrne and Tessa flicked off the flashlight and skirted down the nearest functioning escalator to the 1st floor, clearly distressed from the events that had just occurred, but attempting to avoid further encounters with the careers. The blackout had lasted long enough in the afternoon that the sun was already setting by the time all 3 tributes had been killed, leaving the remaining 6 tributes to settle on their own and await the evening's portraits in the sky. The portraits of Terra from 5, Donegal from 8, both tributes from 9, and Scamp from 11 were shown around the arena, leaving just Cinter from 1, Cyprian and Mercury from 2, Tessa from 4, Byrne from 6, and Rosalie from 15 alive. Rosalia commented that these games had felt startlingly short so far and expressed her desire to see more of the arena's rooms utilized in the portion of the games still remaining. Byrne appeared shaken still after killing the 9s the previous afternoon, muttering to himself about bright lights and pacing back and forth while Tessa kept a lookout near the front of Exhibit Hall C. After a few hours, she returned to the center of the hall where Byrne had been sitting and nibbling on the last of his caramel corn as he mumbled quietly. She gently coaxed him to stand up and go to the entrance of the exhibit hall to guard while she ate a quiet breakfast and examined the statues of past victors in the room. Tessa began to exclaim over how lifelike she found the Dollar Crusoe statue to be, admiring its fine features and strong resemblance to the real victor. Byrne stared off into the distance, apparently not even registering her squeals of interest as she poked and prodded at the statues of the victors. However, he did look over when one of her squeals turned to a shriek. The dollar statue, according to Tessa, had somehow moved its arm so it was pointing directly at her. Byrne shrugged and grumbled to his ally that she must have accidentally hit it somehow. Tessa frowned, replying that she had only touched the statue a little bit. When he raised an eyebrow, questioning the nature of this touch, she admitted that she had to take the opportunity to feel up the legendary Dollar Crusoe, father to many descendants across Panem, even if just for a little bit. At once, all of the statues jerked to life and slowly turned towards her on their display podiums. Byrne appeared fascinated by this and seemed intrigued by the mechanics of such a phenomenon. Tessa screamed and began to run, but the statues strode forward off their podiums and closed in around her to form a tight circle, the hollow yet recognizable faces of every past victor regarding her with a cool gaze. Byrne watched in a daze as he witnessed the statues closing in on her, followed by a high-pitched mechanical screeching and whirring as they raised their arms out to her. The girl let out a strangled scream as she was lifted into the air by the statues, and slowly but excruciatingly torn limb from limb by the merciless figures. Tessa's screaming was cut off by her cannon as the statues slowly returned to their places and powered down. Byrne had seen this go down with a cool neutrality and glazed-over eyes, to the point where Rosalia remarked she could not tell if he was aware of what had happened or feigning unawareness when he had calculated such a move all along. Byrne did not seem keen on remaining near the murderous victor statues for the rest of the day, so he explored throughout the bottom floor and happened upon Exhibit Hall H, which contained a costuming studio. Byrne appeared intrigued by the studio and poked around, noticing some supplies scattered around that had belonged to the deceased Donegal. Byrne stepped over a pile of folded parkas formerly belonging to Maxima Lou and gingerly picked his way through statues of boxes filled with glittery accessories, recognizable to viewers as replicas of accessories worn by Celia Barrett, Lena Siragon, and Heifer Muller during their victory tours. As he picked his way through, he muttered something about how strange it was that the capital had themed the games around many of the victors that it had killed or imprisoned, though he immediately regretted saying this as he noticed a camera in the corner. He was startled from his reverie by footsteps outside, pounding down the carpeted hallway. Byrne dived behind a cluster of mannequins just as Rosalie from 15 charged into the room and slammed the door behind her, sighing in relief. She failed to notice the boy peeking out from behind the mannequins, gears turning rapidly in his head as he tried to figure out how to handle this unexpected situation. Rosalie discovered a sewing kit on a table strewn with fabrics and inspected it with great curiosity, pulling out the needle inside and pricking her finger to test its sharpness. Audiences around Panem watched with bated breath as Rosalie passed within inches of Byrne's hiding place, mumbling to herself in French and picking through the clothes strewn all over. Reaching behind him, he withdrew an object that was difficult for the cameras to capture but seemed to twinkle slightly. Byrne's hands trembled as he held the item up and the faint sunlight from the windows reflected off it. Suddenly, Rosalie turned around and froze as she realized she was looking directly into his terrified eyes. She screamed and leaped backwards, jabbing a finger at him and waving the sewing needle with her other hand. Byrne slowly stood up from behind the mannequins while hiding his hand behind his back, apologizing for scaring Rosalie and offering to ally with her until more of the careers were gone. Rosalie appeared to consider the offer once the shock had worn off, but ultimately shook her head and turned around to leave. She replied in English that she just wanted to survive and did not want to have to kill anyone else, including an ally. Byrne looked grimly at the retreating girl, then down at the item in his hand. Taking a deep breath and raising his arm into the air, he hurled it as fast as he could across the room in a flash of light. The cameras focused in on the object, which was revealed to be a heavy hair clip. It whistled through the air and rapped her sharply across the back of the head as she cried out in alarm and fear. Byrne sprinted forward, intending to tackle her from behind to prevent her from escaping, but noticed something sparkly on the floor and scooped it up with great interest. Rosalie turned, holding her aching head to ease the pain from the heavy hair clip, as Byrne held up a great ruby brooch, a replica of one formerly worn by Mirai Kobayashi, with a glittering needle, thin as a stiletto knife. Narrowing his eyes, he plunged the razor-sharp brooch pin into Rosalie's throat, slicing across an artery and sending blood spraying everywhere across the piles of clothing in the area. Rosalie's eyes widened in shock as she fell backward and choked on the pooling blood in her throat, her cannon sounding in moments. Byrne exhaled and wiped the brooch off on his jumpsuit, kneeling in a pile of Victory Tour garments and sighing deeply. He ran his hands through his hair as he had done once before and appeared to be talking to himself, whispering that he knew now why his friend had tried to escape, even if it had cost him and his loved ones a great amount of pain. Laying down in a fetal position and running his fingers over smooth mint green taffeta, part of a suit that fell on the ground during the scuffle with Rosalie, he appeared weary and closed his eyes, mumbling something about the bright light streaming through the windows and how it reminded him of the White Room. Byrne continued to lay there for the rest of the night, eyes closed as he rested amid the colorful clothes strewn across the floor, and appeared to be murmuring something, his lips faintly moving. Suddenly, he jolted up late in the evening, eyes wild, and spun around. Byrne hurled a loafer shoe at the single camera in the room, knocking out its feed, and crouched in a defensive position as if preparing to fight off an attacker. He shouted a series of expletives, apparently swearing at someone or something, which were captured by the camera outside the room, and he staggered backwards toward the window. He then gritted his teeth and let out a roar of pain as he realized he had trodden upon his brooch on the ground, shaking and pointing an accusing finger at the camera in the hall as he growled that it had taken him a year and dozens of sessions in the White Room to forget, but that he finally remembered his identity. While he did not disclose this identity on camera, it was clear that he had struck a nerve with games officials, who quickly sent out an order to the editors to capture different camera angles that showed just how deranged this tribute was behaving. The only indicator we have as to what Byrne may have been signaling with his outburst is that he picked up a squirrel fur stole from the floor as he said this, running his fingers through it and glaring up at the cameras. However, further raging on his part was prevented by the portraits of the fallen, which were then shown in the night sky and quickly distracted him. Tessa from 4 and Rosalie from 15's faces flashed across each room, which disoriented Byrne and caused him to sink to the ground, holding his head in pain. He fell asleep soon after, rolling around in a fit of agonized nightmares. Over at the career's new camp the next morning, after a restful night, Mercury set up a small triage center in the corner of the ballroom to continue handling the Alliance's injuries. Cinter casually leaned against the doorframe and guarded the camp while Mercury tended to Cyprian's cuts and bruises from the blackout, occasionally snapping at him to sit still and shut it when he turned around to make silly faces at Cinter, to which he scowled and complained that she was being bossy. After the events of the past day, the group was slightly battered, although they had received a few small sponsor gifts of ointments and bandages to help with the injuries sustained. Cinter pondered aloud that the Capitol must have had hope for one of the non-career tributes left, or was waiting to see if the careers would turn on each other, since they had not received any substantial sponsor gifts so far in the games, aside from the night vision goggles. Mercury nodded to him as she finished bandaging Cyprian's wounds, inviting the boys to swap places so she could attend to Cinder and Cyprian could guard from their remaining opponent. During this time, backs turned to the door as Mercury worked on spreading ointment and bandaging Cinder's injuries. The pair failed to notice Cyprian grinning and bolting out of the doorway and down the escalator to the first floor. Looking around furtively, he scooted over to the macebuck stand at the far corner of the first floor, throwing open the refrigerator doors and eagerly pulling out a bottled caramel macchiato. With an almost gleeful ease, relieved that Cinder was not around to stop him anymore, he popped off the cap and chugged the entire bottle in a single gulp, letting out a contented sigh and belching afterward as he remarked aloud that he had waited nearly the entire games to have one, as soon as he was safely out of Cinder's sight. For several minutes, as he tossed the bottle in the trash and wiped off his hands with a napkin, there appeared to be nothing amiss, save for his multiple rounds of push-ups and declarations that the drink had made him feel more alive than ever. However, some eagle-eyed viewers, Rosalia Sanchez included, noted that his hands seemed to be trembling slightly. After several more minutes, in which he continued exploring behind the counter, his entire body slowly began to shake as he stared around in confusion and fear at why he could not control himself. Moving jerkily, Cyprian dragged himself back around the corner and vomited noisily into the trash can, scrabbling around to try and find a source of water to offset the caffeine, but there were no water bottles or water fountains in the immediate vicinity. Cyprian continued dragging himself away from the stand and panting, his body shaking and seemingly attempting to contain the energy coursing through it. Rosalia commented that Cyprian appeared to be experiencing an extreme caffeine overdose and wondered aloud if the game makers had spiked the drinks at the macebuck stands with high doses of caffeine to deter tributes from drinking them. As he stumbled his way to the escalator, his body staggered to the side and he struggled to push through his dizziness to get to safety. Cyprian began to mutter to himself rapidly, although Rosalia had difficulty determining in her commentary what he was attempting to say. In a bizarre twitching motion, he collapsed to the ground, body convulsing in rapid and uncontrollable motions as it tried to cope with the caffeine coursing through and raising his blood pressure. Cyprian clutched at his chest and left arm before vomiting again, alarming many capital citizens, who appeared deeply disturbed. After several long minutes of unappealing retching and clutching at his chest, Cyprian fell to the ground and heaved his last breath, twitching, before his cannon sounded. Rosalia admitted that she had not enjoyed watching this spectacle, as dramatic as it had been, before expressing her sympathy for Cyprian and admitting that while she felt that she herself could not live without a nice macebuck's caramel macchiato every morning, unfortunately it seemed as though Cyprian had a bad case of the jitters. Upon hearing the cannon, Cinder and Mercury had glanced at each other in shock, worrying that it was down to the three careers and they would have to battle it out at that very moment when they had just been bandaging each other's wounds. Almost instinctively, both looked in unison at the doorframe to gauge Cyprian's reaction and yelped in alarm as they discovered that he was not there. Mercury worried to Cinder that Cyprian had been abducted and taken out by their last remaining opponent, swearing loudly about the gravity of the situation, yet Cinder shook his head and replied that he did not think Cyprian would have been successfully abducted without making enough noise to alert them to his disappearance. After a moment of pensive thought, Cinder quietly muttered, "Those blasted macchiatos," and explained to Mercury he believed Cyprian had snuck off and gotten into a supply of spiked drinks. Mercury appeared bewildered by this statement, but accepted the explanation regardless, and the pair prepared their belongings to track down Byrne. They searched through all of the ballrooms on the third floor before proceeding down to the second floor. After not finding anything for several minutes, they entered the room where Mercury had earlier been searching with Neela. Cinder appeared intrigued by the stacks of boxes and started to comb through them out of curiosity, while Mercury edged over to the covered box of action figures and peered inside once more. Casting a furtive glance over at Cinder, she withdrew an Alexander Nicolai action figure from the box and held it up to catch the light. She called out to Cinder to look at what she had found, showing him the action figure posed with its tiny dual swords and grim expression. Cinder gasped in surprise from across the room and peered at it, excited to see his district's first victor of the third incarnation represented in action figure form. Mercury asked if he would like to hold it and held it out towards him, quirking an eyebrow. He nodded eagerly and remarked that he had been touched by Alexander's tragic story in his games. Mercury shrugged casually and tossed the Alexander figurine to Cinder before sprinting out of the room. He only had time to stare in confusion at why his last remaining ally was fleeing the room before the figurine touched the palm of his hand and blasted his body to pieces. Mercury covered her ears outside the room and winced as she heard the whirring hovercraft picking up his remains. Once she was safely outside and tossing her hair over her shoulder with a casual attitude, Mercury appeared to have an idea and noted that the sash on the tribute uniform seemed to be made of a slightly adhesive material. As she unzipped her backpack, she very carefully removed several of her action figures and affixed them to the sash, bandolier style, for easy access. Mercury methodically searched the rest of the rooms on the second floor, armed with her knife and the action figures, but found nothing other than assorted Victor memorabilia. She then moved down the escalator to the first floor, glancing around and watching out for any sign of an ambush by Byrne. Across the first floor, Byrne poked his head out from the costume studio, having heard the great explosion a minute earlier when Cinter was blown apart by the Alexander action figure. He held out his blood-stained brooch with the pin turned outwards as if preparing to stab any attackers, although there were none in his immediate area. He slowly inhaled and exhaled after hearing Cinter's cannon and stepped out of the costume studio. The arena went dead quiet as the cameras panned between Byrne, sweat beading at his brows, heart pounding, crouching behind a pillar in the lobby as he clutched his brooch, and Mercury, goggles propped on her head and action figures slung up across her chest, holding a knife and poking around near the escalator as if enjoying a vacation rather than hunting a tribute. Mercury turned ever so slightly, just enough to notice the tips of Byrne's dark curls poking out from behind the pillar, and immediately charged forward at him. Byrne looked up in alarm and jumped, realizing she was reaching for her sash to fire a Victor action figure. He appeared bewildered as she pulled out a Celia Barrett figurine and aimed it at his pillar, but smartly dived out of the way and darted into a nearby restroom. It took Byrne a moment before he realized that he had entered the women's restroom rather than the men's restroom, but he rolled with this unexpected turn of events and locked himself in a stall before closing the toilet seat and standing atop it. Meanwhile, the figurine ricocheted into the pillar where he had been standing a moment before and sent it crashing to the ground. Mercury rooted around in the rubble from the collapsed pillar outside, hoping to hear a cannon or find a body, but there was nothing. After a few minutes of searching in the area, confident she had seen Byrne but confused as to where he had gone during the explosion, Mercury began to look around in the restrooms. As she suspected, Byrne had not gone into the men's restroom, but she debated spending time looking in the women's restroom or simply moving on and trying to find where her opponent had run during the chaos. Byrne sucked in his breath as Mercury decided on the former option and headed into the women's restroom, scanning the room and checking in and under each stall. Just as Mercury was about to reach the end stall, where Byrne was perched atop the toilet, he glanced around in fright and leaped up. He vaulted over the top of the stall door, using Mercury's head as a stepstone, and sprinted back out into the lobby. Mercury cried out in anger and humiliation as she realized her opponent had just stepped on her head and escaped. She pursued Byrne back out through the bathroom entrance, watching him dive behind the guest services desk to avoid the Danny Wu figurine she had hurled in his direction, and shouting verbal abuse at him for having stepped on her head with his toilet-stepping shoes. Byrne smirked and replied with a surprising confidence that clearly the contents of the toilets were not the only pieces of censored in the arena, irritating Mercury further as the offending term was bleeped out for capital children. Byrne climbed back out from behind the desk and scrambled over to the Macebuck stand, seizing a spiked Macchiato. Rosalia Sanchez wondered if he was planning on drinking it to end himself, admitting that this would be a rather anticlimactic ending to the games. Instead, as Mercury caught up to him and prepared another figurine, he unscrewed the cap and threw the bottle as hard as he could at her, the contents flying out and splattering Mercury in caramel syrup and milk foam. The pair began to fight their way up the escalator, with Mercury backing Byrne up onto its stairs and wildly throwing action figures left and right as she grew frustrated with her failure to hit him. In the meantime, the action figures careened into various other places around the arena and sent minor explosions blooming behind the battling pair of tributes. Eventually, as the action figures missed their target multiple times, she realized she had run out of the ones on her bandolier sash. Cursing loudly, she reached up into her bag to take out more. Byrne grinned at his success and at having infuriated his opponent, scurrying up the escalator to avoid retaliation. However, Mercury was quickly recovering and stuck out a leg to trip him before he could get any further up the escalator. Both of them then fell back down on the escalator by accident, landing on the first floor again in a heap of tangled limbs. Scrambling to his feet, Byrne was quicker to escape and led Mercury into the exhibit hall with the Victor statues, which had since returned to their posts after eliminating Tessa for touching them. Byrne's newfound confidence was a stark contrast to his behavior the previous night, leading Capitol commentators to question the attitude change and why he had suddenly become so energetic after hiding for most of the games. He gleefully led Mercury through row after row of Victor statues, creating a dizzying sight for viewers as the furious girl from 2 reattached exploding Victor figurines to her sash and fumbled in her efforts to catch up with him. Whenever Byrne got out of her sight, he cheerfully circled back to be just out of her range, only to sprint away the moment she regained her bearings. After several long, breathless minutes of this wild chase, Mercury sank into a crouching position, leaning on her knees to catch her breath under the weight of her bags and figurines. She scowled up at a nearby statue of Rubius Dalton, muttering that she never liked Manicure Man, and seeing his game's commentary, while Byrne appeared at the end of this row with a radiant smile, asking if they wished to keep up this chase all day. Mercury snarled and leaped forward, causing them to continue circling the victor statues at a progressively slower speed. However, even as Mercury became tired, Byrne seemed unaffected and continued to watch with amusement from afar. At this point, the girl from 2 was so exhausted that she dumped out an entire bottle of water over her head to avoid overheating, while Byrne tentatively asked from afar if she was done yet. She was clearly too weary to answer, and instead demanded to know why he was so energetic after running for around a half hour. Byrne shrugged and admitted that he had realized something the previous night that had restored his hope in the games. Mercury pressed him for details, attempting to buy some time to recover, while he explained that he had broken free of their control and finally remembered his identity. His opponent furrowed her brow, confused, as he turned to a camera on the other side of the room and explained that even the White Room could not break him, pointing a defiant finger at it and stating that he was not Byrne Sorkin, that they could take away his life, torture him, and replace it with that of his executed best friend, but that they would never take away his true self. As the majority of Panem watched in complete bewilderment, while certain high-ranking Capitol officials glowered at the camera feed, Byrne spread his arms wide in a taunting gesture and encouraged the Capitol to come at him, as he had nothing to lose anymore, and that he was proud to be not Byrne Sorkin, but the real Casper Myers. A moment of confused silence passed, followed by a small explosion as Byrne disappeared amid a shower of sparks and smoke. All of Panem struggled to see through the smoke clouding the camera's view, only to find a coughing Mercury wringing out her hands and the remains of a Selena Brax action figure bouncing away from where Byrne had just been standing. His own body, charred and scarred, lay in several graphically disjointed pieces across the floor, which was now speckled with ruby blood. As the smoke cleared, Mercury grinned in relief, admitting that the Selena Brax figurine had been especially powerful, before quipping that she was getting kind of tired of the monologuing and just wanted to get it over with already. While viewers across the nation stood rooted to their seats and positions in shock, attempting to process what had just occurred, head game makers Lock and Lock hastily announced that Mercury Valens of District 2 was the victor of the 106 Hunger Games, and a hovercraft arrived to pick up the slightly smoky, but still very pleased, new victor. Rosalia arrived to the victor's interview in a fiery red spandex gown, commemorating the tribute outfits from this year's games. She greeted the assembled live audience with warmth and excitement, as Mercury had been a popular victor in the Capitol and her interview was highly anticipated. Mercury was brought out a few minutes later wearing an elegant scarlet dress with a sash to remind viewers of her storage of the action figures on her bandolier sash, as well as a ruby brooch. She graciously curtsied to the audience and greeted Rosalia with a cheeky grin before settling into her seat for the evening. Rosalia had nothing but praise for Mercury, revealing that she had already been voted to be named the Capitol's convictor. To commemorate her games, Rosalia herself was designing and producing a line of Victor figurines known as Victorines that would roll out a new figure each year. At the time of the interview, Rosalia had designed all of the figurines of the third incarnation victors up to now, and eagerly awaited next year's games to continue making more. The pair discussed Mercury's games and how difficult it had been for her to keep the career packed together and functional, while Mercury rolled her eyes at the footage of her allies' blunders, ensuring plenty of laughs and sympathetic noises from the Capitol audience. She admitted that while she sometimes had difficulty controlling her temper, and this had clearly shown during the games, she was always ready to take on a challenge and try new ideas as both a tribute and a future mentor. The screen behind Rosalia and Mercury replayed some of the more iconic moments from the games, including Mercury's shocked expression after realizing the action figure she had thrown at Neela had exploded and killed her, Byrne and Tessa pushing the Nines down the escalator, and Mercury leading Cinter and Cyprian around during the arena blackout, resulting in them comically bumping into each other and various objects in the arena. Mercury soon exited the stage after the interview amid cheers and a shower of flower bouquets from the enthused audience before Rosalia welcomed in head game makers Lock and Lock. Wearing matching spandex jumpsuits that complemented Rosalia's dress well, they took their seats to thunderous applause from the live audience, who had been bewildered by the end of the games but pleased to see a fan-favorite tribute in the Capitol claim victory. Rosalia learned from the pair that the reasoning behind the unconventional convention for the arena was because they had been looking to bring together the past, present, and future of Panem through the games, with the past being represented by the homages to past victors, the present being represented by the arena and recent victors' weapons, and the future being represented by Mercury Valens' victory. Curiously, any mention of the Burn/Casper incident was omitted from all post-games analysis, and a large amount of Capitol propaganda in the following months portrayed Burns Sorkin as having gone insane and lost his sense of identity while in the arena. Rosalia pressed the game makers for the details of next year's arena, but the only information they would disclose was that it was likely to be one of their favorite games yet, and that they had followed up on the success of this year's arena and ideas. The pair concluded by giving the assembled audience matching bows and mischievous grins before taking their leave of the stage. Rosalia reminded viewers to tune in later for Victory Tour coverage before concluding with her catchphrase, "Good night, Panem." Mercury returned home to District 2, where she would go on to mentor future tributes alongside her former mentor, Celia Barrett. In fact, it was while mentoring tributes during the 113th Games that the infamous train restroom incident occurred. See File 22 for more information. It was reported that she had a few different affairs, including with some prominent Capitol citizens, though none of these were known to end well, and there was one occasion in which a spurned lover egged Mercury's house. Mercury was known as a major presence at many Capitol parties, and often held her own parties in the victors' village of District 2. However, the scandal she was embroiled in along with Celia resulted in embarrassment to both of their reputations for many years. Nevertheless, Mercury remained a more popular figure than Celia due to her relatable attitude towards other well-known personalities, such as the time she wrinkled her nose at the stench emanating off a neighboring Capitol official's skunk fur boa at a banquet, and it was broadcast on live television. Many incidents such as this one managed to somewhat preserve her good image despite the scandal surrounding her name. She was also known to live up to her name and had quite the mercurial temperament, often becoming irritated and grumpy over minor inconveniences, to the point where some of her future mentees referred to her as Grandma, even when she was only in her 20s. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this installment of Panem Reborn. I know I like writing it, so I hope you enjoyed as much as I do. And I also want to let you guys know, just a reminder that as I said at the beginning of the video, there's going to be a Q&A either next episode or the episode after that. Probably going to be the 108th Games, not the 107th Games, because the next week's episode is anticipated to be pretty long. So it's probably going to be the 108th Games, and I will leave a pinned comment under this episode in order to let you guys know, like, you can ask questions here, so feel free to add any responses to that comment with your questions. I'd also like to clarify something from this Games. I just know that people might be theorizing about it, so this is what I wanted to say about it. So I believe with the Burn Sorkin/Casper Myers situation, the real Burn Sorkin was the one who was executed to punish Casper. Then Casper was tortured and given surgery to make him look like Burn, because President Mace would not want to just let him get away with dying. You know, he would want to torture him. He would want to make him feel the effects that his embarrassment caused to the Capitol. So then he made him kind of forget his identity through this torture. But then Casper's family was executed and he was returned to Burn's family. And because he looked so much like their son, they accepted him as their son and they thought he was the real Burn. So yeah, that's what I wanted to tell you guys. I just wanted to let you know that because I know this episode can be a little bit like, whoa, that happened, but that's really what I thought was going to happen. I didn't think President Mace would just let him off easy by killing him with a single bullet to the head. I think he would want him to suffer. So just wanted to let you guys know that. And lastly, a quick reminder, please join the Discord if you're interested in doing so. I promise Mercury Valens is not standing behind me with an exploding action figure to my head, so just keep that in mind. And just remember, Panem today, Panem tomorrow, Panem forever.